Hi, folks. Welcome to the Gloucester Writers Center's Right Way Up. My name is Ken Riaf, and I'll be talking this evening with Chris Monkholm, who's right here in Manchester by the Sea. Just do a brief introduction. Chris, hi, first of all, welcome.
Thank you.
Uh,
Happy to be here.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad to have you. Just by way of brief background, Chris, in 2013, she was the founding director of the Gloucester Marine Genomics Institute right here at the head of the harbor in Gloucester, which is a marine biotech training academy doing work on fish genomics. And she has a doctorate of chemistry from Tufts University. And most recently, she's the founder and editor of Cape Ann Cosmos, which is a arts, entertainment, and events magazine. It's on the net, not a physical magazine, at least not yet, right?
No, nothing in print.
Nothing in print, which she started in 2019. And tonight we're here to talk about her book, her recently published book, which is called Atlas Decrypted. There it is. And it's a very interesting read, and not a big book, but a lot of big concepts and ideas in here. Uh, Chris, it's about this book that came out a long time ago, Atlas Shrugged, by Ayn Rand, back in the late 50s. And it may be known to a lot of people who are listening, who are watching, but it's also probably not that well known to other folks. And it was a bestseller, millions of copies sold in its time, as I recall. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about the author. We could start there. Ayn Rand, can you tell us who she was?
Yes, that's a great place to start. Ayn Rand was born in 1905 in St. Petersburg, Russia, and her family lived through and lost everything, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. She managed to finish college, but she was determined to leave Russia, and she got out on one of the last remaining student visas, and she headed straight to Hollywood. She had always loved American movies. She loved American culture. She loved the American founding fathers. And she had found her home, and she worked in one of the studios doing odd jobs, and she wrote at night. She had wanted to be a writer since the age of 9. She published a couple of novellas, and then in 1943, she published her first big success, and that was The Fountainhead. And that was successfully made into a movie by starring Gary Cooper, and she was very involved in writing the screenplay. And now she was famous, and now she had the means, and she moved to New York City with her husband, Frank O'Connor, and it took her 13 years to write Atlas Shrugged. And you're right, Ken, it was published in 1957, the same year that Jack Kerouac's On the Road was published. Two
Right.
out novels.
Right. So, but I mean, so that's her background. Now, she was not an uncontroversial writer. I mean, she wrote on political subjects, and so she was a bit of a lightning rod for a political opinion. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, she was very, because of her experience in Russia, she had saw how communism had destroyed the way of life in Russia. So she detested anything that in the least bit resembled communism. So she saw, whenever she saw any evidence of the collective winning out over the individual, that type of dynamic, she always came down on individual rights. And so this put her in somewhat in opposition with some of the political positions in the United States, which are not communist, but maybe drifting towards large government programs, that type of thing she often didn't favor. And I think that's what sort of, many people thought she was libertarian, which she was not, The libertarians adopted her because she was a small government person. Some people think that she's conservative. She's not. She really didn't identify with any political parties. She was very unique, though, and she was very adamantly against communism.
Well, I think a lot of those debates are still going on today, and so it's
Oh, yes.
interesting to see how they've evolved and how they've also stayed the same. And so,
Mm,
uh, trying to get focused on Atlas Shrugged, I mean, it's not one of those books where you can say, "Well, give me a synopsis, give me a brief overview of Atlas Shrugged." It's over 1,000 pages,
it
but
is.
you're familiar with it enough to be able to nutshell it a little bit for us. Can you tell us what the book was essentially about, the themes, the plot, to the extent that you think it's important for people to understand? I mean, there are going to be people that have read it, obviously, and there are going to be people who have not. And in your introduction, you're suggesting that, in order to appreciate your book, it would be good if they had read this book. But tell us about the book itself.
Yes, in a nutshell.
In a nutshell.
Nutshell. I mean, I actually do think of it as is the structure is sort of like a long Russian novel with a very complicated plot and many characters. But it's also an American novel about industrial capitalism. And the way she has constructed the Atlas Shrugged is probably the best way to give a synopsis. She has two repertoire groups, and one of the protagonists are the characters in which she has poured her ideals. And it's important to keep in mind that Ayn Rand considered herself an author and a philosopher in equal parts. So her ideals, her principles, her values, this is important content to her, and her protagonists all embodied her ideals. And they were the people with skills. They were the engineers, the scientists, the entrepreneurs, the bankers, the doctors, the writers, the musicians. These were her protagonists. And then you had the other repertoire group, and these are the antagonists. And these are the people without any of the skills, but they have acquired the power through various corrupt ways. So you have the crony capitalists, you have the corrupt politicians, and you know who the antagonists are in Atlas Shrugged. You know who the protagonists are. And what Ayn Rand does, she stages throughout the novel these interactions between the two. One is trying to assume the control of civilization. The protagonists are trying to save it until they give up. And it's battling philosophies. And this is something that Ayn Rand, I think, is uniquely and brilliantly capable of doing. The dialogue, the narratives, it's all philosophical behaviors, decisions, and outcomes. And I think it's one of the reasons why young people really embrace the book, because you can see these role models for philosophical choices, and people are inspired by many of the protagonists. And
Oh,
then what happens, and I'm really summarizing, the
yeah.
protagonists
Uh-huh.
decide they're cutting out, they cannot save civilization. The antagonists eventually self-destruct, and that's the end. So this is no blueprint for how to to manage civilization, but that's the structure that Atlas Shrugged is written around, and much of it is brilliant, and much of it is a great read.
So, one of the protagonists that you sort of center on is a woman whose name is Dagny Taggart, and maybe we could talk a little bit about her, and then how this drew you into your theories about certain aspects of the book. So, who is this main protagonist, and why is that person attractive to you?
Well, yes, that's a perfect place to start for my book, Atlas Decrypted. So let me set the scene. It was 1988, and I was about 2/3 of the way through my dissertation, the research I had to do for my thesis. So long days in the lab. my two sons were still young, but they would go to sleep. And then I'd have a couple of hours at night to read. This was pre-digital era. There was no internet to waste my time with. I had always been a voracious reader. I had read Fountainhead. I loved it. And now I was reading Atlas Shrugged, and I found it really engrossing. But in 1988, let's set the stage now sociologically, the women's movement had acquired traction. There were many more options in the world for women than there were in the 1950s when Atlas Shrugged was published. And keep in mind, so this character, Dagny Taggart, she's one of the protagonists. So she's a female who Ayn Rand has created with these incredible attributes. She's an engineer. She's the COO of a railroad company. But not only does she have that position, everybody so greatly admires her. She has such self-possession, and she's very attractive. The male protagonists all fall in love with her. So here was a person who I had never seen anybody with these attributes. And I found it very fascinating. And so I began to wonder at some point why Ayn Rand had named her Dagny. I thought it was an odd name. It didn't have any of the, I'd say, grandeur of the persona Dagny Taggart. And so I started looking around to see if there was any information on the naming of these protagonists. I couldn't find anything. Barbara Brandon, who was a good friend of Ayn Rand, I heard her interviewed on the Larry King show. Somebody called in because Barbara Brandon had written a book and asked where'd the name Dagny come from. Barbara Brandon didn't know. So I thought, well, maybe there is no reason. And yet the protagonists were Ayn Rand's ideal personas. I couldn't imagine her not investing something in their name. That was my gut feeling. So,
and by the way, while you're just taking a sip there, I noticed that in the book, you talk about that interview, and it sort of sparked your curiosity. It sounds like, I mean, that's where it started when it's I mean, just for a moment to say that this book that you've written is really an investigation. You're sleuthing and trying to approach your subject using the scientific method in many respects. So Dagny Taggart is the person, the character who first drew you in, yeah?
absolutely, absolutely. And via her odd name. And so sometime, maybe a couple years later, it was almost an unconscious process. I began to see in her name symbols for a chemical element. And I'm talking about the spelling of her name. And the symbols for the chemical elements are all nicely summarized on the periodic table.
They are.
Yes, they are. And what I saw was in Dagny Taggart's name, the symbol for the element silver.
Which is on the table.
Yes.
What is it?
I recommend you look at your
yes.
table, which you should have nearby. And I won't spoil the fun for you. Everybody can go look it up. You'll see what the symbol is, and then you can look at the spelling of her name.
These are the symbols, yeah.
There you go. AG. AG.
And AG, for those of us not fluent in the periodic table, maybe you can tell us what these elements are.
Yeah, well, so we have copper at the top, then AG is silver, and then AU is gold. So these are the precious metals. These are the three elements. They're co-located in the periodic table. So I thought that was interesting because there's a lot of references to science and technology in Atlas Shrugged. But, that's all I had, nothing more than that. But it was interesting enough to provoke me, because at that point is when the real forensic investigation began. I thought, if there's a chemical element in one name, maybe I can find one in another name. And so I dived back into Atlas Shrugged with the purpose of looking at the names of everybody. And what I found in the protagonists, I found 3 other characters that had the symbol for silver in their names. So now we're starting to see a pattern. This is getting to be a little too much to ignore. And then I found the character who was identified with copper, and that was Francisco d'Anconia. And then I had what I consider one of several eurekas. I identified the character who was identified the character who's associated with gold, and that would be the marquee character, and that is John Galt. And we don't have enough time to get into all the details of how I made those associations, but that was my my data set that I felt was pretty interesting.
And you're using, at this time, you're using your training, education as a chemist, as somebody who's steeped in the scientific approach to problem solving. And you're using that to follow this sort of little breadcrumb trail through the book, yeah?
Yes, absolutely. You'll see in the writing of my book, there's a lot of discussion about where I'm looking at the data and thinking about it scientifically, but also realizing that I was not studying the laws of nature. I was studying Ayn Rand's creative process. So I'm trying to do a scientific study with a lot of literary license. So it's a little dicey, you know. But yes, but you picked up on my approach. Absolutely. But now what I had, Ken, I had a data set, but I did not have a hypothesis. And when you're doing a scientific investigation, you start with a hypothesis, something that you want to prove. And then you do your experiment and you acquire your data, and then you analyze it and you decide, well, does it support my hypothesis? I didn't have a hypothesis. And so it was a conundrum. I was stuck there for a while. And so I approached some people in the Rand world. There's a lot of Rand scholars. There's quite a large movement of people who have developed around Rand's writings. And so I contacted some people, and if they knew anything about this nomenclature that I was identifying. And it was very disappointing. One person told me there was nothing left to discover in Atlas Shrugged. Now, one should never say that about anything. Another person said that, Ayn Rand was not a chemist. She would never do such a thing. Well, I managed to refute that in my chapter 6, which I think definitely refutes that. And somebody else wouldn't even accept any money to read a summary of my thesis I was developing. So I didn't get any help there. So I was alone with my data set for a while. And but at this point, I knew I had something. I was like a dog on the hunt.
Right.
And I wasn't going to quit. I'm a pretty persistent person when I want to solve a problem.
And so that's what kept you going. And it's interesting too, because I mean, I think at some point in the book, I mean, you feel yourself, and you're telling your readers that you're sort of being dragged into this, you know, I don't know if you described it as a rabbit hole, but you know, there's people that are in a rabbit hole and they don't know it, and then there's people who are in one and they do know it, and you had the, you know, ability to assess your geography there, but there you were, and you still went forward. Yeah.
Yes, I did. And as I said, I felt that I was onto something, and I knew Ayn Rand was very purposeful, and so, but I must admit, my sons got so tired of me talking about it. You know, it was something I said, oh, am I ever going to finish this? But then I had, I think, a key eureka, and that really helped me bring the investigation home.
Well, tell us.
Okay, now this is, you know, this is a complicated literary analysis of a complicated book, but I'll tell you what started to happen. So I'm reading the book and I'm beginning to pick up on Rand using some of the terms and the language around alchemy.
Alchemy.
Alchemy,
Yes.
yes.
Tell us what alchemy is.
Well, alchemy was a belief that swept the world. We're talking about, in the early medieval ages, it was a belief that you could make gold out of a base metal like iron or lead. It didn't matter which base metal, but you could, if you knew. So the whole formulation was a base metal, the Philosopher's Stone, and you would get unlimited gold. And gold was the coinage of the realm.
Mm-hmm.
So this went viral all over the Middle East, the Near East, Europe, into China for 800 years. This became a phenomenon that drove people to this obsessive search. And what they thought they needed to find was the Philosopher's Stone. This was the missing ingredient. They had the ore, but there was no Philosopher's Stone.
And I'm just going to stop you there for a moment to ask you, and again, for our benefit of our audience, when you're referring to Philosopher's Stone, what is that? I mean, what is the?
Well, they thought it was some solution, some tincture, some substance. And so what you see in the literature of alchemy, and it's fascinating, it's beautiful. They wrote in these Baroque languages describing their preparation for the Philosopher's Stone. And
I see.
it would go on for weeks, and they'd call the raven phase and this phase and that phase. But they never once produce a single speck of gold. It's scientifically impossible. You can't convert you can't convert a metal into gold. It's scientifically impossible. They didn't know that at the time. And
Right,
so even Isaac Newton was trying his hand at alchemy while he was inventing classical physics. So it went on that long, it reached every level. Kings were trying it. So finally, with the advent of modern chemistry starting in about the 17th century, people realized that alchemy was a lost cause.
yes, yes, right. And to this day, that seems to be the case. But it sounds like people, given what gold represents in culture, it sounds like it was the kind of thing that people kept trying because the rewards would be very great. But alchemy in this book or in your book, I mean, it's also it's a metaphor for something. Yeah.
Yes, well, thank you. And that's what happened to alchemy. Alchemy transmuted itself and became a metaphor. And I do have a chapter in my book. I think it's a standalone chapter. It's called Alchemy, Equation, Myth, or Metaphor. And it has history of alchemy, and I highly recommend that chapter if you'd like to read my book without reading Atlas Shrugged. But yes, what happened is alchemy transmuted into a metaphor. It's part of our vernacular now, and it's always used as some kind of conversion from some low state to a high state. The sinner becomes the saint, the mortal becomes immortal, the corrupt becomes purified. It's always an alchemical transmutation into some higher state. You never see alchemy going from high to low. It's always low to high.
I see. And so what's your take on that? I mean, in terms of and I just want to get back to that, but in terms of taking something of a, like you say, a base metal and turning it into something, a precious metal, or to take somebody who is in a low state and bring them to a high state, or taking a product and value adding to it and bringing it to a higher state. I mean, that's all part and parcel of this. Yeah, is that?
Well, yes, and where I saw Ayn Rand going with the alchemy as a metaphor was, I discovered she had embedded into one of her protagonists the name. She embedded the Philosopher's Stone into the name of her the professor of philosophy who specialized in reason-based processes, which is basically the heart of the scientific method. So when I saw that she was making connections between philosophy of reason, the scientific method, and the scientific method, which can transform some starting condition into a higher condition, I saw Ayn Rand circling around the scientific method as an ability to actually cause this change of one substance to a more valuable substance. And then I saw how she was using this alchemical language and transmutation around her protagonists who had the real skills. They weren't dealing in a mystical process. They were scientists and engineers, and they knew how to, they had the knowledge to take something and convert it into something else of a higher value. And that's really the basis of our entire civilization. Everything is now, I look at my desk here, everything is some kind of synthetic material that started as some kind of, lower value commodities, and then the application of some scientific knowledge and process, you're able to synthesize everything that's in our modern world. And so I saw how Rand she understood that mechanism. And I actually give her credit in my book. She discovered I would say, the real Philosopher's Stone, and that would be the scientific method.
Right. I mean, just to for a moment, I mean, you allude to the power of scientific innovation, and that's I guess that's bound up in your hypothesis about how this all coheres, and as you're saying this thing about taking something of lesser value and converting it to something of higher value. I mean, in a way, that's the capitalist system, and in a nutshell. I mean, where you take something and you refine it, or you take something and you modify it, or you produce it in a mass way. I mean, that's how our system sort of works. Yeah.
Oh, well, absolutely. And I would say after I saw that what she was doing with the Philosopher's Stone, I found the piece de resistance in Atlas Shrugged, the great example that she provided around that, and that is the character of Hank Reardon. And his entire life is he has a foundry that produces steel alloys, and so he starts with ore, which is the same thing the alchemist started with. He starts with ore, but he ends up with these important steel alloys, of which our entire civilization is built on. In fact, steel alloys are much more valuable than gold. You can't build out of gold.
That's true.
And so I call him the industrial alchemist. He starts with ore, he ends up with the steel alloys, but how does he do it? The science of metallurgy and the application of really intense engineering controls. And so he, in my opinion, he symbolizes what you were just describing. It is the process that's building our modern civilization. And he is the industrial alchemist. And at that point, I could see it all working together, how her protagonists were these people who were aligned with scientific processes, and they were the ones had the ability, and it's not easy to have the cognitive ability to invent on the foundation of scientific knowledge and come up with all of these incredible materials that we all depend on now for our safety, our comfort, our luxury. It's the world we live in.
Right, and alloys, as a general rule, I mean, they're combining of different substances to make a stronger bond, something that has more tensile strength, something that has, just higher qualities. And that's what happens when you bring divergent things together in a mixture, as opposed to any one of them standing alone.
Well, right. That's, yeah. And in Atlas Shrugged, Hank Rearden, it takes him 10 years to formulate the alloy that became known as Rearden metal. And it had all of these superb and superior properties, which actually had incredible leverage throughout all of civilization, because anything now built with Rearden metal would have better specifications, because it all translates throughout everything, everybody who uses this metal. So the amount of value that an innovation like that can enhance throughout civilization is enormous.
Hey, Chris, we only got a couple minutes here, so yes, we're getting down to it, and I'm just trying to think, your sort of conclusions about the book, the characters, and the way in which folks relate to these. Are there things that you would want your readers to know, encourage them to explore in our last couple of minutes here? What themes, what philosophies, you know, will they,
Yeah,
yeah.
if they want to read Atlas Shrugged, they might read it through this thesis that I'm proposing. If you haven't read Atlas Shrugged by the age of 40, it might be difficult to get through. But I think it's a very admirable. I'm very impressed with what Ayn Rand has done artistically, the craftsmanship of the book, how she has layered this metaphor in. I think it's a very ingenious work of craftsmanship in her book. And I've written my book. I sort of summed it up as sort of a quasi science paper to make my case. So if anyone should read Atlas Decrypted, you'll get the data, the hypothesis, the background, the theory, and then my proof, which I find in Atlas Shrugged that Ayn Rand did build a very important theme around scientific innovation in her novel.
Well, thank you. And of course, that is always the thing. You have to show your work, your proof, right? When you're doing,
That's what you do.
yeah, when you're doing equations, you have to do that. So, thank you again for spending time with us this evening. And if folks want to get a copy of this book, yeah, where do they find it?
Well, it's on Amazon, Kindle, paperback, hardcover. If they want a signed copy, they can track me down at my office at 2 Blackburn. And if anybody wants to talk to me about the thesis, I'd be very happy to do that.
Well, great. Thanks again, Chris, for taking the time this evening. And we'll see you around the campus. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Take good care now.